Hey everybody, we're going to continue our lesson on scientific notation a little bit more. I know Mr. Kate already talked to you about converting from scientific notation to standard and vice versa. Today we're going to get into it a little bit more and start to use operations with scientific notation. So this is just the outcome I need you to know. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to write, add, and subtract in scientific notation. Now don't worry, the adding and subtracting you can use our calculator with, and I'll show you how to do that just in case you forgot from the calculator video. Okay, before we get into our first example, I just want to reiterate a few things. Remember, whenever we're working with a value in scientific notation, you have this value, let's just say D, and it's always times 10 to a certain power. Remember, this value right here has to be greater than or equal to 1, but it also has to be less than 10. So remember, this value out in front can be greater than or equal to 1, but also less than 10. Remember, in scientific notation, it's always times 10, which gives us our order of magnitude to that certain power right here. So that's like our magnitude, or how many times you're moving your decimal point. Or you could also think of it this way, that's how many places you're counting, or how many digits you're counting. You count in the original value. And remember, Mr. Kate always had us starting with the number 0. So that's just a quick summary of scientific notation. If we get on to our first example, it's giving us a value right here. 234.567 is equal to every one of the following. So it's equal to all of these. However, only the first is a representation of the original value in scientific notation. I want to know why the first is only written in scientific notation. Well, this goes back to what we talked about before. Remember, this value out in front has to be greater than or equal to 1 but less than 10, so this is between 1 and 10. We also have times 10 to a certain power. This next one is not because of this value right here. That number is not greater than or equal to 1 but less than 10. Same with this. 23 is bigger than 10, so it cannot work. 234 is greater than 10, so it cannot work. Same with this. Remember, all of these values out in front, for it to be in scientific notation, have to be between 1 and 10. So if we move on to another example, what I want you to try to do on your own is figure out exercises 1 through 6. So there goes the bell. In exercise 1 through 6, I want you to decide if it's written in scientific notation or not, and if it's not, you need to explain the reason why. So pause the video, and when you're ready to check your answers, you can press play. So for exercise 1, yes, this is written in scientific notation because we have a value that's between 1 and 10, and then it's times 10 to a certain power. Exercise 2 is not because this value is not between 1 and 10. It's actually less than 1. Exercise 3 is a yes because we have a value between 1 and 10. Exercise 4 is not because of this little puppy right there. It says addition. We never add with the power of 10. You always have to multiply. Exercise 5 also is not in scientific notation, and it's not because this value right here is not between 1 and 10, and also that 5, scientific notation is never expressed with a base of 5. It always has a power of 10. And for exercise 6, yes, this would be in scientific, whoops, I have the wrong color. For exercise 6, yes, this is in scientific notation because the 8 is in between 1 and 10, and it's multiplied by 10 to a certain power. Just a few things before we get on to the next example. I know Mr. Kate already showed you the calculator video, but I just wanted to show you one other thing that one of his students brought to our attention. So if you want to do something in scientific notation, here's another way to write it. So say I wanted to do 8 times 10 to the 4th power. I would press 8, and then I could press this key, which gives me times 10, and then I would just type in my exponent of 4. That's going to be another way to write it in scientific notation. If you're unsure or unclear of what I mean, raise your hand and your teacher will come to your desk and help you out. Okay, so for this example, the first thing I need to do is rewrite 26 million in scientific notation. So if I do that, I would have 26 million. And remember Mr. Kate's way of doing this, we count to find out what our exponent would be. So I would have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 as my exponent. Also, remember you always put your dot in between there. So we would have 26 million would be equal to 2.6 times 10 to the 7th power. Now I have that in scientific notation, so I'm going to rewrite it. Make sure to put it in parentheses because that's what we have to do when we use our calculator. And I'm going to subtract it from Dakota, which was 6.9 times 10 to the 4th. It was already in scientific notation. And actually, we're not going to make you do this by hand. You can type this number exactly as you see it in your calculator. So why don't you do that for me now? So in your calculator, depending on what mode you're in, you might have seen this value, 25,931,000. But that's not your answer. We always want your answer to be in scientific notation, so it has to be something to a power of 10. So remember, that's when you go back in your calculator and hit mode to go and make sure you're in the scientific notation mode. If you're unsure or forget where that's at, please ask your teacher at this time. So if you did this correctly, your final answer would be 2.5931 times 10 to the certain power. Do you see the calculator's doing all of the work for you? So just make sure you are aware of that. If you did not get this answer that I have in green, make sure you ask your teacher because you want to know proper use of the calculator. So here's another problem, and we want to know the combined mass of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, which is basically your water, H2O. So first thing, as always, we need to rewrite our values into scientific notation. So remember, like Mr. Kate said, draw a line after your first digit that's non-zero. We start at 0 and we count. So if we would start at 0 and count the whole way, we would get to 27. So for hydrogen, I would have 1.7 times 10, and remember, since it's a value less than 1, it's to the negative 27th power. I would want to do the same thing with oxygen. So if you rewrote oxygen in scientific notation, we would have 2.7 times 10 to the negative 26th power. So to get my combined mass, remember I have 2 of the hydrogen, so I'm doing 2 times what one of the hydrogen were in scientific notation. Make sure to put parentheses around that. Plus 1 of my oxygen, and make sure you put parentheses around your oxygen. If you type that in your calculator exactly as you see it here, you should get the answer of, and I'm going to write it up here, 3.04 times 10 to the negative 26th power. If you did not get this for your final answer, what I just circled, which is right here, ask your teacher, because you either plugged it wrong in your calculator, or maybe you didn't put parentheses around it, or maybe you're just not in that scientific notation mode. So make sure to ask your teacher if you did not get this answer. Okay, so I'm going to work on exercise 7 with you, and then I'm going to let you try exercise 8 on your own. So for exercise 7, it says, what is the sum of the debts for the 3 most populous states? Well, the 3 most populous states are California, New York, and Texas. But I only want to know the sum of their debts, and I need to express my answer in scientific notation. So as you can see, I just popped up a calculator, and I just want to let you know we are able to use our calculator on types of questions like this. So what I would do in my calculator is make sure that in my mode, hit mode right now everyone, and make sure you're in the scientific mode. And then once you are, just exit out of that. Now you literally can just type in this value in your calculator. Type that in and hit enter. Once you do that for California, in scientific notation, you would have 4.07 times 10 to the 11th power. And I'm putting that in parentheses. I always put each in parentheses. Then I'm going to do the same for New York. So I'm going to type in this value in my calculator for New York, hit enter, and you still should be in the scientific notation mode. For New York, you should have 3.37 times 10 to the 11th power. And lastly, we're going to add it to Texas. And for Texas, we should have 2.76 times 10 to the 11th power. Like I said, this is if you put it in your calculator. And of course, the phone rings. Just hold on tight. Okay, sorry about that phone call, but right now, if you type this in your calculator exactly as you see it here, your final answer should be 1.02 times 10 to the 12th power. If you did not get that answer in your calculator, now's the time to ask your teacher. If you did, let's move on to part B. So for part B, what is the sum of the debt for the 3 least popular states? So for part B, you are going to be doing the same thing, but this time we're dealing with the 3 least populous states. So we would be dealing with North Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. So if we look at the sum of their debts, which would be right here in this dark blue color, we're going to do the same thing as we did for question A. So, to rewrite North Dakota's in scientific notation, once you plugged it in your calculator, you would have 4 times 10 to the 9th power, plus for Vermont, you would have 4 times 10 to the 9th power, plus for Wyoming, you should have 2 times 10 to the 9th power. If you plug that all in your calculator, your final answer should be 1 times 10 to the 10th power. If you are not getting any of this, now is the time to ask. I cannot stress that enough, that you need to know how to use your calculator for your PSSAs and for your test. Moving on to part C. How much larger is the combined debt of the 3 most populous states than that of the 3 least populous? So all you're doing now is subtracting your answers from A and B. So for the 3 most populous, my scientific notation was 1.02 times 10 to the 12th. I always put this in parentheses. And I'm going to subtract it from the 3 least populous, which was 1 times 10 to the 10th. As always, plug that in your calculator exactly as you see it, and your final answer should be 1.01 times 10 to the 12th power. Like I said, ask your teacher for help if you are unclear of how to plug this in your calculator. You guys don't know how nice you have it. You have it made because we're not making you do this by hand. We're letting you use a calculator, so please take advantage of it. So for exercise 8, I want you to try letter A and B on your own, but this time we're dealing with the sum of the population of the 3 most populous states. So you're only looking at the population column and using that. And for part B, the sum of the population of the 3 least populous states. So try to do A and B on your own and get your final answer in scientific notation. When you are done doing that, you can press play to check your answers. So for letter A, you should have 8.3 times 10 to the 7th, and for B, 1.892 times 10 to the 6th power. If you did not get those, as always, ask your teacher for help. Moving on to part C, approximately how many times greater is the total population of California, New York, and Texas compared to the total population of North Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming? If I want to know how many times greater something is than the other thing, you will always divide. So, just like before, you're going to take the sum of the population from part A, which was in scientific notation. So I would have 8.3 times 10 to the 7th power, and I'm going to divide it by what I got for the least populous, which was for part B. And when you do that in your calculator, make sure you put parentheses around that like I did. You would get roughly 4.39 times 10 to the 1st power. And let's say this question didn't want you to leave it in scientific notation. They wanted you to go back to standard form. Remember, that's when you can press your mode key, go to your normal mode, and hit enter, and it would express your answer in non-scientific notation, which is considered standard form at roughly 43.9. So depending on what the question's asking for on your test or PSSAs, make sure to check your answers and make sure you're in the appropriate mode. Okay, exercise 9 is the last example we're going to do together, which talks about what is the average distance. So remember, what I'm going to do is basically when I find the average, I add up, in this case, my 2 different values and divide by 2 because I only had 2 different values. So I'm going to take, and they were already written in scientific notation, so I would take 3.004 times 10 to the 9th plus 2.749 times 10 to the 9th. And remember, I'm going to divide it by 2 because I had 2 different quantities in my numerator. So the first thing I would do is what is in my numerator, and when I do that, when I just add those values, I would get roughly 5.753 times 10 to the 9th power. Remember, I still have to divide it by 2. So when you're doing this, make sure you put what's in your numerator in parentheses and then divide it by 2. Your final answer should be 2.8765 times 10 to the 9th power. So your homework is going to be this problem set right now and then an additional page of problems that we would like you to try. Remember, use the yellow calculator. If you're unsure of something or of how to get something on the calculator, now is the time to ask. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.